Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real honor to be here today, and I have to say that I have a wonderful job since my research at the moment is on tourism. I have the onerous task of coming to New Mexico to study tourism, and to be one myself. So, without further ado, Okay, and I have to apologize for the quality of some of my images. Some of the things I'm showing are really hard to find, so please accept my apology. Okay. In this 1942 photograph, the artist Max Ernst poses in an immense chair in his New York apartment, surrounded by smoke, and, if you can see, with a Kachina doll prominently displayed to one side. Ernst was one of many artists and intellectuals who discovered the Southwest after World War I, seeking solace in its visual grandeur, historic ruins, and isolated Indian communities, far from the chaos of modern life. In many ways, this is also the prevailing narrative of the Anglo artists working and living in the Southwest at the same time. Both the Santa Fe and Taos art colonies were conceptualized and actually realized as essentially masculine. Indeed, the story of art in the Southwest between the wars, with the exception of the history of a very few successful Native American women artists mostly, still focuses mostly on the achievements of men who painted, exhibited, and sold images for increasingly high prices across the nation, and that tell a grand narrative of the West. This is Chris in the studio. The story of the preservation and revival of Indian arts and crafts at this time has recently revealed the role played by large numbers of women who worked on, fought for, and even underwrote the exhibitions, collections, and publications that promoted the cause. But there's another story, one in which a significant body of Anglo women who came to New Mexico for a variety of reasons made a place for themselves within the local and national art world, and also created a wide range of less traditional artistic images, from illustrated tourist and folk literature, to magic lantern slide illustrated lectures, to mural painting, to glass painting, to embroidery, clothing design, and even the design of china patterns. Many were illustrators for national magazines, an activity that at the time was considered suitable for young women, because it did not encroach on the professional work of real, as in male artists. Many women in the Southwest wrote and illustrated children's books, some of which can still be found in libraries today. My talk addresses three questions. What kinds of visual culture of the sort that we might describe as historically off the grid did these women produce in New Mexico? And what does it tell us about the ways that these women survived and thrived in their arts here? And what is the significance of this body of work? Clearly, some of these women came to New Mexico for family reasons, whether voluntarily or not. Some also came to escape the formality and socially entangled world of urban society and the constraints placed on women trying to establish successful art practices in New York, for instance, where opportunities for women were few and far between, and where women had to defend the professional nature of their work constantly. Women were expected to paint, draw, sing, play music, and sew on a strictly amateur basis in order to decorate and thus become decorations themselves in the home. As B. Mandelman wrote later of Taos, one of the reasons she came, it was the most isolated place you could go in the United States. It was a very good place to sort of hide out, and a good place to turn inward and find out who you really were. New Mexico thus offered a respite, even if temporarily, from increasingly difficult urban culture in America, and it also offered a new as yet unimagined opportunities for women. And in the case of my research, specifically opportunities for women who produced in one way or another a visual culture in New Mexico that was imbricated with, but often functioned separately from that Anglo men at the same time. Indeed, a Sunset magazine article of 1916 stated, "In the entire Union there is no other state which offers to women such rare opportunities for a field of action broader than their time-honored domestic sphere than does the state of New Mexico. It is a pioneer in occupations unusual for women." The women of my study created a visual culture that still demanded regional or national circulatory patterns for dissemination, validation, and even sale. But while it sometimes paralleled that of the dominant masculine art world that we all read about in our art history books, it was often very different from it and is still relatively unknown. Okay, so who were these women and what did they do? I'd like to present to you a few of those I'm studying today, hopefully to reveal some trends that I'm beginning to see, and I'd like to show you some of their less known work in the hope that you'll be as pleasantly surprised and interested in it as I am. Santa Fe boasted a lively cultural and intellectual scene that included some impressive women by the early teens. Willa Cather, for instance, arrived in 1915, and Mary Austin around 1918. Of the wealthy women philanthropists, art collectors, and donors, Mary Cabot Wheelwright, seen here, arrived in 1917. Florence Dibble Bartlett and Amelia Elizabeth White and her sister Martha arrived in the early 1920s. Mary Coulter redesigned the interior of La Fonda in what was to become known as her Southwestern style in 1929. Ina Sizer Cassidy, the artist, poet, author, and long-term art critic for New Mexico magazine, arrived in Taos with her husband in 1913 and settled in Santa Fe in 1915. She was the first to showcase consistently and repeatedly in print the art of many of the Taos and Santa Fe women artists. She also directed the WPA, that's the Works Progress Administration Federal Writers Project, that was a New Deal aid for working artists in the state between 1935 and 1939, of which notably 41% of those hired were women. Elizabeth DeHuff, of the women who worked in Santa Fe, many were not directly involved in producing what I call traditional visual culture, but they nonetheless contributed mightily to the way New Mexico was both envisaged and imagined between the wars. One of the first to arrive in Santa Fe was Elizabeth DeHuff, who was educated at Barnard College, and I'll be giving you a lot of information about these women, and what I want you to sort of think about is not so much sort of remembering all the names and dates, but seeing trends. For instance, most of them are highly educated at the time. Elizabeth DeHuff was educated at Barnard College in New York and arrived here at age 24 with her husband, John DeHuff, who had been appointed superintendent of the Santa Fe Indian School. Elizabeth DeHuff immediately generated controversy by inviting several students, including Fred Gabote, Otis Polili, I cannot pronounce his last name, I'm sorry, and Bulino Herrera, to her home to paint traditional Hopi and Zia images at a time when the assimilationists were still strongly opposed to such activity. She lectured widely, wrote a prodigious number of articles, several books, collected Indian folk tales and songs for publication, and even wrote and produced a play with Native American actors only. She was also noted among locals and tourists as an engaging, authoritative lecturer for the Indian detours at La Fonda. And this is, oh, I'm sorry, you can hardly see it. This is a page from the lecture notes, where in the detours at La Fonda, where she described the state and its people with the aid of a series of magic lantern slides, possibly those made by Lord Gilpin, which the Harvey Company subsequently purchased. And I just want to show you the next one and the next one. Those are photographs from the folio of Indian detours. Indeed, DeHuff's lectures were so popular that the Harvey Company sent her lectures and slides in hand on a tour of the eastern states. DeHuff also wrote children's books, several of which she illustrated. were illustrated by her Indian school students. She published 16 books in total, including Tay-Tay's Tales, Tay-Tay's Memories, Swift Eagle of the Rio Grande, also illustrated by Fred Bote, Five Little Kachinas, there's the Eagle one, sorry. Five Little Kachinas, Two Little Hoppy, Hoppity Bunnies Hop, and the next one, Little Boy Dance, of which we'll hear more later, and Pals, illustrated by the artist Gerald Cassidy. There are three more of that. Okay. Erna Ferguson. Erna Ferguson, who you see here with what seems to be a detour driver in the foreground, was one of the very few women in my study to come from a long-standing New Mexico family on both sides. She grew up in Albuquerque, graduated from UNM in 1912, earned a master's degree from Columbia, and served as state supervisor for the Red Cross during the First World War. Between 1921 and 1926, she and Ethel Hickey ran Koshari tours from Albuquerque, personalized 3-day tours designed to take in as many Pueblo dances as possible. They offered dudes, as Ferguson called her tourists, the feeling that they were roughing it. But in fact, the reality was that tents and cots were set up for them, professional chefs cooked for them at cookouts, and they traveled around the state in air-conditioned Franklin sedans. The Harvey Company hired her away in 1926 to establish La Fonda's famous Indian detours. Detour guides, called couriers, this is one here, picked up dudes at the Laramie train station, drove them in luxury Packards back to La Fonda Hotel, where they could choose from several 1- to 3-day tours. Ferguson's deep knowledge of the state informed the education of her fleet of highly educated young women. The couriers had women and informed a generation of tourists about the history and culture of New Mexico. Ferguson resigned in 1928 to devote herself to writing about the state. She noted, "I was working on the Albuquerque Herald. I was doing society notes and I got quite bored with that." So she began to write a long-running series of articles called Do You Remember Old Albuquerque? Her first book, Dancing Gods, was based on her Koshari and Indian detours experiences. She published 5 other books, including Mexican Cookbook, and there's another one like that, and Our Southwest, and 2 children's books on Hawaii, as well as dozens of articles. She was described notably as a popular lecturer and a historian, but she was also a charming conversationalist and a gracious hostess. And she insisted on the same qualities in her 20 couriers. Beatrice Chauvenet, I'm sorry about this awful slide, one of Ferguson's couriers was Beatrice Chauvenet, who graduated from the University of Michigan Phi Beta Kappa and had, as one biographer described her, a talent for getting interesting and productive jobs. She worked as secretary for the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal between 23 and 26. And in 26, she visited the Fiesta in Santa Fe, heard about the Indian detours, and immediately applied to become a courier, a job she held until 1929. Her sister also became a courier. Chauvenet later worked in various administrative capacities throughout the state of New Mexico in health services, and she wrote several books on the state, including John Gaunt Neame here, Hewitt and Friends, next one please, and The Buffalo Head. And another one, next one, okay. She also wrote at length about her courier experiences, including off-hours romances between couriers and drivers, or couriers and dudes, and the fact that local artists were, quote, kind enough about opening their studios to detour guests, where artists occasionally made sales. She also spoke about the ways in which local artists, writers, and sometimes tourists formed inextricably interwoven communities at the time. and of the time that her sister served as courier for John D. Rockefeller. Olive Rush was from a devout Quaker family, studied at Earlham College in Indiana and at the Art Students League in New York. And in 1924, as a woman, was only permitted to observe but not take classes at the Howard College School of Illustration. One of her fellow observers, not students, was Blanche Chloe Grant, who later moved to Taos. Rush also studied at the Corcoran School of Art in Washington, D.C., in Cornwall, England, and in Paris, and with the American Impressionist Miller, although notably, Impressionism was, by that time, considered a female style. She garnered an impressive reputation for her work on the East Coast, but moved to the Southwest with her father in 1914. Before 1920, she worked as an illustrator for Harper's Brothers, and her images graced the covers of several widely read magazines, such as Good Housekeeping, Scribner's, Woman's Home Companion, and one more, Sunday Magazine, and St. Nicholas Magazine, and Couriers. She served on the staff of the New York Tribune and illustrated several books. She was active in the Santa Fe art scene in the 20s and 30s and exhibited her work on the East Coast at the Corcoran and at the New Museum of Modern Art in New York. During the Depression, she worked for several WPA agencies, federal agencies, painting murals for the Santa Fe Public Library, the biology building at UNM, all of these. She painted backdrops for, amazingly, the Mayan Temple at the New York World's Fair in 1939, and in 1935, and Mazel's Trading Post in Albuquerque. I brought those, there are 3 of those. 2 more. In 1935, she created a mural for the inner dining room at the Fonda, as well as for several private homes, including Mary Wheelwright's, and she also painted propaganda pictures during the Second World War. Like DeHuff, Rush also taught at the Santa Fe Indian School, working with Harrison Biguet, Awa Sire, Pop Chali, and Pablita Berard. In 1934, she was named to the advisory committee for Indian art for PWAP federal program. And in 1935, the students decorated the dining room at the Indian School. Later, some of the panels were shown at the Rockefeller Center in New York. Eugenie Schonert graduated from New York School of Applied Design for Women, where she studied with the giant of decorative painting, the Czech painter Alphonse Mucha. She studied informally with the sculptors Bourdelle and Auguste Rodin in Paris, won several major prizes for her art in Paris. Her work is in major public collections in France, at the Cleveland Museum of Art, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and in fact, Ina Cassidy described Schonert as one of the best sculptors of the day. Schonert was known mostly for her sculpture in granite, in marble, wood, and keystone, an artificial stone, and for her decorative bronze cast and building decorations, such as this. And these garden decorations were the primary road to fame for women sculptors at the time. She also sculpted portraits of luminaries such as Igor Stravinsky and her favorite, Dinah, the gorilla at the Bronx Zoo. She made an animal fountain for the Children's Hospital at Truth or Consequences, studied pottery with her friend Maria Martinez, and also made Santos. She was a furniture designer and also made decorative lace. You see the pattern here? The next one, Agnes Tate, was a painter and one-time leading lithographers of her time. Came late to New Mexico. She worked mainly on the East Coast, painted canvases and murals for the PWAP, including a panoramic image of skating in Central Park that is now in the Smithsonian Institution. She and her husband Bill McNulty moved to Santa Fe in late 1941 when Tate had already illustrated Heidi for Angelo Patry, But in New Mexico, she illustrated Paco's Miracle by Anne Noble Clark. And there are two more of this. She was a friend of both Schonard and Brush. Okay, in Taos. In Taos, a smaller, more isolated and more rugged town, several wealthy women dominated the cultural scene between the wars. The most notable in many ways was the social and art maven Mabel Dodge Lujan, who held court and patronized the arts in Florence and New York before she came to Taos. She moved to Taos in 1916 at the behest of her then, although not for much longer, husband, Morris Stern, who had written to her, "Dearest girl, do you want an object in life? Save the Indians, their culture, reveal it to the world." Indeed, that became one of her missions in life. She was not only very active in projects to preserve and revive what she imagined was the former glory of Native American culture and art, but she married Tony Lujan, a Taos Indian, much to the envy of her social circle in New York. Artist Gisela Loeffler described Lujan in Taos. She kept some kind of order there. She really did. Mabel would drive around in her car to see what was going on. She had to be in on everything. And indeed, that was the case. Lujan's Taos residence was constructed with the express idea of hosting an international literati and artistic elite. For Lujan, despite her highly vocal and repeated assertions to the contrary, the beauty of Taos and the primitiveness of the Taos Pueblo people, that's her term, were of worth only when shown off to those at home in New York and beyond. In the manner of a rather typical tourist, in fact, she claimed the prerogative, at least in her own mind, of revealing the beauty of the Taos Mountains to intellectuals, writers, poets, composers, artists, and photographers of such significance as Willa Cather, Thornton Wilder, D.H. Lawrence, Lujan's, could go back one, sorry. Lujan, Lawrence, and Dorothy Brett, Lady Dorothy Brett, Andrew Dasburg, Ansel Adams, George O'Keeffe, and Rebecca Salisbury James, Laura Gilpin, and many others. Elizabeth Harwood, and I'm sorry I couldn't find a picture of her, so I just showed you the whole museum, and her husband also moved to Taos in 1916, where they established the town's only library in their home, to which Lujan actually gave generously. After 1924, they also exhibited the art of many local artists, including several women, and in 1935, the Harwood Foundation was gifted to the UNM. It has functioned as the town's major museum and cultural center ever since. Elaine Wurlitzer is described by her foundation for artists, founded in the 1950s, as a gracious, quiet, and unassuming presence in Taos, who was a generous, substantial, and long-time patron of Taos artists, but, as they say, went unnoticed by many Taoseños. The more flamboyant and what we'd probably now describe as high-maintenance Lujan reportedly felt usurped by Wurlitzer's final generosity to the art colony. Millicent Rogers did not settle in Taos until 1947, but her presence as a supporter of mostly Native American art and as a competitive socialite also generated jealousy in Lujan, who had hoped and wished to be the leading luminary in town as the sole hostess of the Eastern elite. Mary Green Blumenschein visited Taos in 1913 and in 1919 moved there with her husband, the artist Ernest Blumenschein. Mary Green Blumenschein trained as an artist at the Pratt Institute. She spent 15 years studying and working in Paris, where she won acclaim as an artist and even a gold medal at the Paris Salon. She taught at the Pratt Institute in New York, exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she also won a medal, and became an associate member of the National Academy of Design. Women were not admitted as full members. The National Association of Painters and Sculptors, and the Society of Illustrators. She became a well-known illustrator in New York, where she worked for such major magazines as The Illustrator, Century, and McClure's, for which she illustrated a widely read serialized story of the young girl Bambi by Marjorie Bettencook. You'll see a little arrow at the top, because I could only find this on Amazon. Once she, Ernest, and her daughter had made a somewhat rocky move to Taos, however, Ernest insisted that she relinquish her painting career because, as he put it, there was room for only one painter in the family. Mary Blumenschein's output was more sporadic thereafter. She painted some southwestern images, but worked increasingly in advertising. I love this image. And in illustration for books for authors such as Ruth Tarkington, Jack London, Willa Cather, and for Eleanor Porter's Road to Understanding. 3 more in this series. Thank you. She laid a road of her career. Matrimony means giving up some things and gaining others. And the roles of wife and artist are incompatible. Nevertheless, her painting, Acoma Legend, was selected and shown in the American Painting Today show at the 1939 New York World's Fair. Blanche Grant, and I don't have a photograph of her, sorry, studied at Vassar College and at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts School, the Pennsylvania Academy, and the Art Students League in New York, all the best schools of the time. She studied with one of America's preeminent illustrative artists, Howard Pyle, in Delaware, and then established herself as an illustrator in New York, meanwhile painting portraits with John Johansson. She taught art briefly at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and served as the head of the art program in a Le Mans center receiving wounded soldiers during World War I. She returned home in 1919. Like Blumenschein, Grant's artistic pedigree was impressive by the time she moved to Taos in 1920. But there, within 2 years, she had established herself as editor of the Taos Valley News, if only for a few months, and became one of the time's most committed historians. She continued to show her art in New York and around the country, however, frequently in solo shows, and she also wrote several books on Taos, including The Taos Indians, one more. Kit Carson's Story of His Life, When Old Trails Were New, and Donna Lona, a novel of old Santa Fe and Taos. Next one. Dorothy Brett was born into British nobility, studied at the Slade School of Art in London, where she floated on the edge of the famous Bloomsbury group, and knew such famous figures as Virginia Woolf, Aldous and Julian Huxley, and D.H. and Frida Lawrence. It was with the Lawrences that Brett came to Taos as a guest of Mabel Dodge Lujan, and Brett lived in Taos for 50 years. Brett, a natural eccentric, described the draw of Taos and its people. The American Indian has fascinated me since I first saw Buffalo Bill and his troupe in London when I was only 5. She thrived artistically in Taos, wholly abandoning her largely academic training in favor of a neo-primitive approach. She painted Pueblo dances and religious rituals from memory, since photography was forbidden. Like many of her generation, Brett had no qualms about portraying and thus making widely known the details of the Indian dance that had gained her artistic fame across the nation. Indeed, she even claimed to have helped Indian cultures by making their ceremonies known. She wrote in 1950, to come all this way from England and to find and to give the Red Indian his wider life on canvas seems to have been my destiny. Catherine Pritchard, she's third from the left, hiding behind someone, trained at the Cooper Union in New York, the Corcoran School of Art in D.C., and the Académie Julian in Paris, one of the few independent studios in the city open to women, and teaching largely an Impressionist style. In 1909, and back in Washington, Pritchard taught at the Corcoran School and established a significant artistic practice in the city. She even resigned in 1919 to open her own school. In 1922, Pritchard summered in Taos, where, as a result of her artistic reputation, she was invited in 1924 to become the 10th member of the Taos Society of Artists, a feat that the Washington Post considered noteworthy, especially in light of the fact that the society was, in their terms, not particularly friendly to women. In 1925, she was offered a studio at the Santa Fe Museum and contributed to 6 fiestas. Despite her success in a deeply masculine art environment, Critcher did not regard herself as an advocate for women in the workplace. She spent her summers in the Southwest making art, one summer living in a local pueblo and another on the Hopi Reservation, recording ceremonies in print and paintings. Jean Kloss was educated at the University of California at Berkeley and took postgraduate courses at the Oakland School of Arts and Crafts. She gained a major reputation on the West Coast, where she showed oil paintings and copper-plated etchings around California, in museums, galleries, and even at the Gumps department store. She was a member of the National Academy of Design, won national awards with her work, and her work is in such major collections as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian. In 1925, she married the poet-composer Philip Kloss. The couple honeymooned in Taos and soon thereafter relocated there. During the Depression, she created a number of paintings and prints for PWAP for distribution to local hospitals and schools. Barbara Latham graduated from Pratt Institute, Brooklyn, and the Art Students League in Woodstock, where her teachers included the famous artist Andrew Dalsberg, who later came to Taos as a guest of Mabel Dodge Lujan. She worked as an illustrator in New York for the Norcross Publishing Company and illustrated the articles of a friend who wrote for the New York Times Magazine. In 1925, Latham traveled to Taos with her husband Howard Cook, where she spent the next 50 years. She wrote, however, "When I moved to Taos, I gave up everything in terms of her art. Yet, she quickly created a market for personalized Christmas cards from her etchings. She continued painting, however, and her work is in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum, the Library of Congress, among others. Her illustrations were reproduced in the New York Times, Art Digest, McCall's Magazine, and so on. She also illustrated numerous children's books, including Pedro, Nina and Perito, Hurdy-Gurdy Holiday, there's one more of that, by Leah Gale, Tree Frog, by Paul McCutcheon, okay? I Like Butterflies, and then I Like Caterpillars, and there are 5 of those. Okay, and Honeybee, there are 3 of this. Honeybee Tells Honeybee by Mary Adrian, her personal favorite. Ida McAfee, and I think I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but I can never remember the correct one, graduated from, this is her with her famous Siamese cats, and she trained to make, they could do like 18 tricks, they were amazing. She graduated from Westlake School of Art, the Hoos Art School in LA, and the Western State College of Colorado. She moved to Chicago in 1924, where she became a painting assistant to James E. McBurney and sculpture assistant to Laredo Taft, where she created several small animal sculptures in, believe it or not, ivory soap, and a larger panther that was given to Thomas Edison on his 75th birthday. In 1925, she studied at the Art Students League in New York, was admitted to the National Academy, and married another McBurney assistant, Elmer Turner, in 1926. They also spent their honeymoon in Taos. Next year, Ida made a model for the full-size sculpture of a white horse for a show in San Bernardino, California, and in 1928, the couple returned to Taos and built the White Horse Studio. Ida's illustrations of animals are remarkable. This is one of my favorites. In magazines, were published in magazines and books. Her animal portraits and her animal miniatures, tiny little portraits, attracted such critical attention that she was commissioned to illustrate the famous book. Again, you can see, this is from Amazon. Oh, sorry, just go back one. Also from Amazon. How to Paint Horses by Walter T. Foster. By the way, I bought this one. In Taos, she created over 1,000 easel paintings, thousands of watercolors, and very popular miniature paintings of Native American couples for sale mostly to tourists. During the Depression, she created murals for post offices in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and for the public library in Greeley, Colorado. She also illustrated Catherine Morris Lester's historic costumes, and there are 3 of those. Okay. Jane Richard Mason's All the Year Round. I believe there are 4 of those. It's like furry folk. And she designed fabric, wrapping paper, dishes, and calendars in Taos. Made calendars. There are 4 next. There's some calendars that she. It's good. And published a book on her art entitled Indians, Horses, Hills, etc., etc. Rebecca Salisbury James. Next. Oh, sorry. Next one. Okay. She's on your left. Was daughter of the impresario Nate Salisbury, who was manager of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show in London again. In the early 1920s, she worked as a medical secretary in New York, married Paul Strand in 1922, and was drawn into the Stieglitz Circle in New York. She tried to paint there, but felt discouraged by New York's stultifying artistic environment, especially for women, especially for her. In 1929, she experimented with glass painting, a process that the artist Marsden Hartley claimed nearly killed him. The same year, she summered in Taos with George O'Keeffe, staying in Lujan's Pink House, and produced 12 self-described excellent glass paintings that Stieglitz, in fact, really admired. In 1932, she left Strand and moved to Taos permanently, and ultimately married the rancher and banker Bill James. Taos changed James, she wrote, all my American or Western blood sings in me now. And in Taos, she changed her persona completely. She dressed in pants all the time, which is very radical for women at the time, wore a black Stetson, drank hard liquor, smoked incessantly, swore constantly, and associated with the roughest crowds in town. And as one biographer said, was notorious for her wild, alcohol-laced evenings. Yet, at the same time, Stieglitz was describing her art as revealing such inner abstract feelings as humility, simplicity, solitude, and faith. In Taos, painting was only a small part of James' activity. She took on a wide range of local causes, from paving the plaza to installing street lamps. She wrote frequent, sometimes annoyingly frequent, letters to the editor. She also wrote a Spanish language column. She also began to use culture embroidery patterns to create new kinds of visual images, along with Nellie Dutton, who did much to revive the fast disappearing art. This is James, and another one, James, and then one more, Nellie Dutton. And in the 1950s, James wrote the book, Allow Me to Present 18 Ladies and Gentlemen of Taos, who she described as having contributed to Taos, but not with a brush or a pen. Next one, Regina Tatum Cook lived in Taos between 1933 and 41, and then 48 to 71. She was active in the Taos Art Association activities and served as their secretary for several years. She taught UNM extension courses at the Harwood Foundation, taught at the Beastrom School, and later taught for a period in the Palm Springs and LA public schools. She wrote for Mademoiselle magazine and for Taos newspapers for 23 years, frequently writing on artists. She also wrote features for New Mexico and Golden magazines. She exhibited her paintings locally at the Harwood, Don Fernando, and the Columbian hotels in Taos, illustrated books by Edgar Hewitt, Joseph McSorley, and L. Bradford Prince, and was also a well-known dress designer in both Taos and on the eastern seaboard, and that's what you see here. She actually designed one iteration of the courier outfit that we saw earlier and ran the store Taos Togs. Two more of this. She was described by Ina Sizer Cassidy as a woman of many and varied accomplishments who had a modest, almost shy appearance, the type you expected in a domestic housewife with no thought beyond the walls of her home and the needs of her family. Finally, Gisela Loeffler studied at the School of Fine Arts in Washington University, St. Louis, married Frank Chase, and moved to Taos in 1933 with 2 young daughters, a dog, and $90. She and Isla McAfee, who had one small boy, became close friends. Loeffler engaged in an impressive range of artistic activities. She painted murals in hospital operating rooms and children's wards in St. Louis, Chicago, Manhattan Beach, California, and at the Sagebrush Inn in Taos, the inspiration, by the way, for the shed decorations, as well as for numerous private homes. She made paintings, tapestries, paintings on enamel, and greeting cards. And she painted camouflage during World War II. And she also wrote a column, Gisela at War. She even designed a Happy Time China pattern in 1953, and her house, built on Lewin land, was decorated entirely with her designs, from walls to furniture to lampshades to china. Loeffler was most widely known for her magazine illustrations and children's books. These include Francie and Easy, described by Life magazine as one of the best children's books of all time. El Echeco, there are 4 of this. The Burro Who Sat Down, I think there are 4 of those. And Little Boy Dance by Elizabeth Behuff, who I started the talk with, and there are 4 of those, I believe. Oh no, that's still. Just keep going, please, and we'll. There's 3 more. Okay, that's it. Okay. Luahan described her work in a letter. How people are attracted to your funny little painted children and the sunny, reassuring life you surround them with. What gay, vivid colors you use. This is real folklore you give us, and it makes us forget that sometimes our life is not so gay. And finally, a couple of recurring questions have driven my research for this paper. What place did Anglo women occupy in New Mexico's visual culture between the wars? And what space did they carve out for themselves? Space and place are different things. Place is the place you are locked into by society, either because of class or race or gender or some other non-self-determining factor. Space, on the other hand, is the area that you claim as your own, within which you can maneuver and grow. Place is socially determined, but space contracts and expands in relation to your own individual agency. It's the spaces in which these women, artists and writers in New Mexico between the war, acted that interest me. How they left their mark, and the trace by which culture, society, and ultimately by which we assess them historically. With all of the women discussed today, the parameters of discourse need to begin to flex and expand in order to begin to acknowledge their immense contributions to New Mexico culture as a whole, not just as individual or exceptional women artists or illustrators. Indeed, the study of visual culture is defined by Nicholas Mirzoff and Rogoff as employing a sideways glance, but a glance that sees more than a direct stare. The murals, illustrations, embroidery, clothing, and so on, and particularly the children's books that we've seen today, are only visible when we use that indirect glance. In many ways, they constitute an additional layer of visual imagery that represents sometimes an already highly romanticized vision of the Southwest. These images frequently present a delicious fantasy of an imaginary place and time in the interwar New Mexico, into which the modern world did not encroach. The visual imagery of many of these women operated wholly outside the mainstream artistic discourse of the time, of the day. It was firmly planted within domestic space, both seeming to acknowledge a woman's place in the home and to offer little threat of competition within the male artistic milieu. Yet these images represent a gentle resistance, but a resistance nonetheless to the mainstream. These New Mexico women created a space in which all women artists could begin to move more freely. It was a space in which art production could be created, orchestrated, and operated by women. A place where these women established their own rules and systems of validation outside or beyond, but arguably they created work as significant historically as any of that created by contemporary men in New Mexico. Thank you very much. Yes.
The photograph that you had of the courier, who was a friend of Erna Ferguson, could you give me her name again, please?
I don't have the name of that one, sorry. I don't.
Oh, I thought you had said she was a specific woman.
No, sorry.
Okay.
But I could try to find that out for you. If you want to give me your name. Yes.
So did these women, I mean, they're great artists and they had great abilities. Did they have children too? I mean, you mentioned they
Yes.
had children, so they were raising families while they were doing all of this?
Right, they were raising families. Many of them were trying to survive economically. And they, what really fascinates me is they're doing everything all at once. And that's kind of what I wanted to communicate today, that these women were the ultimate multitaskers. And they did whatever needed to be done to sort of bring money into the home as well as to create these works. So I think, there's a great deal in these books especially that, there's a great deal of artistic passion in them, but there's also, this need to bring in an income. Yes?
This is a fascinating subject, and we'll look forward to your book. Gisela Loeffler, for what it's worth, did, when we stayed at the Sagebrush Inn 40 plus years ago, the furniture in the room, I don't know if those pieces are still there, chairs,
really?
little tables that she had painted.
Okay, let me write that down.
So I don't know if the Sagebrush still has those tucked away somewhere, if they're still in the rooms or not. They were beautiful.
She has an amazing sort of vision. It's sort of, at first when you see it, it looks a little bit kind of like Hallmark images, but once you become accustomed to it, it's really, really very brilliant and really wonderful imagery. Yes.
Would you mind doing the Sunset Magazine quote again?
Oh, which was that
It was,
one? What, the women?
About women. The women's
Yeah.
position.
Let me find it.
I'm sorry, I can't find it.
Oh, I can find it quickly.
I thought it was just a really, really nice outfit sort of.
Yeah, they're great. Oops. But I'm all going backwards now.
It was pretty early.
Yeah. Okay. In the entire Union, there is no other state which offers to women such rare opportunities for a field of action broader than their time-honored domestic sphere than does the state of Mexico, which later is complications unusual to women. Lovely, isn't it?
Do you have the records for that?
I do, yes. It's from 1916. I don't have it written on my script here, but I can send it to you. And if there's anyone here who knows of any of these books or any of this kind of work that I'm not familiar with, because it's been kind of hard going finding a lot of these things. Yes?
Did you exclude, or maybe I missed it, Alice Corbin Henderson for some reason?
Yes, I did, only because I had limited time and I was determined that I was going to make this 45 minutes long. I'm not sure I made it, but that's the only reason I excluded her. I have a long list of dozens of these women who are all kind of operating just beneath the radar. Really amazing. Some of them not only beneath the radar, but exhibiting nationally this kind of work beneath the radar. Anything else? Well, I'm happy to talk to anyone if you want.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank my assistant here, who was brilliant.